How did American policy or practice contribute to the present Mindanao problem? We see four major contributions of United States policy to the Mindanao problem. The forcible incorporation of Mindanao on Sulu into the Philippine colony, resettling of Christian natives to Mindanao, the discriminatory land laws and attempt to annex Mindanao, Sulu and Palawan into the U.S. territory. Forcible incorporation of Mindanao on Sulu. The first obvious contribution of the Americans to the Mindanao problem was when they included Maguindanao and Sulu in the purchase made during the Treaty of Paris. As pointed out already, the two sultanates used to be independent from Spanish Filipinas, yet deliberately the Americans still included them, and what made things worse was that they completed the subjugation of the Moros and therefore succeeded in forcibly incorporating them into the predominantly Christian Philippines. In other words, the United States stole the three independencies from the three sovereign states when she signed the Treaty of Paris in 1898. The example of this is she took away not only the independence of Aguinaldo's Republika ng Pilipinas but also the independence of Maguindanao and Sulu Sultanates. When the United States decided to leave in 1946, she, however, gave independence for Pilipinas, including Maguindanao and Sulu. Thus, the Muslims, Christians, and Nomads became citizens of a republic comprising at least two nations. Resettling of Christian natives to Mindanao. After the subjugation of the Moros, the Americans introduced in 1912 the idea of resettling landless but industrious farmers from Luzon and Visayas to Mindanao. This was meant to ease out the agrarian unrest brought about by the Hacienda system or the inequitable distribution of lands in the north. The planners or architects of the settlement scheme also believed that this is one way the Moros could be united with the Christian Filipinos. This is the policy of assimilation by colonies, combining a minority of Moros with a majority of Filipinos. The American colonial government so encouraged the Christian settlers to the extent of giving them free transportation, financial and legal assistance, farm tools, and other implements. We even learned that in Cebu, the Americans had difficulty at the start of getting Cebuanos to settle in Mindanao because the latter were fearful of the Muslims, perhaps due to their experience in the Spanish-Moro Wars, and thus not easily convinced to go to Mindanao. Thus, the Americans had to lure the corn-loving Cebuanos with hybrid American corn and somehow tell them that these were the corn of Mindanao and if they want it, they have to go to Mindanao. These efforts, though well-intentioned, began a systematic agrarian program called Moro Colonies. These efforts, though well-intentioned, um, began a systematic agrarian program called Moro Colonies, also agricultural colonies, which American administrations under General John Pershing and Frank Carpenter established in the Cotabato Valley and Lanao. Seven such colonies were established in Pikit, Pedro Pulangi, Pagalungan, and Glan in Cotabato, and Mumongan in Lanao. The latter reserved for destitute Americans with Filipina wives. The above information should be enough to be enlighten us about the American contribution to our present problem. In the first place, it was the Americans who introduced the idea of bringing the Christian settlers to Mindanao, who, in fairness to the latter, would pour out their energies to develop the lands the colonial government granted them. Take note that during the Spanish period, the violence between the Muslim and Christian populations was largely psychological. There was very limited physical encounter between them, except in military expeditions, which did not happen on a regular basis. But the American program of bringing over Christian migrants to Mindanao did not only generate further resentments among the Muslims and Lumads, but also it created a permanent and ready venue for the eventually frequent and bloody physical encounters. Apparently, both are unaware they are victims of unfortunate colonial decisions. Discriminatory land laws. The Moros did not only dislike the coming of Christianized natives from Luzon and Visayas, but resented as well the passing of several discriminatory land laws. And these laws include Act number 496 of 1902, otherwise known as the Land Registration Act. This act required the registration of lands occupied by private persons or corporations, and it also required that the application for registration of title shall be in writing, signed, and sworn by the applicant. Note that this law was implemented in 1902, while the first schools in Moro and Lumads areas were established in later dates. In Cotabato, the first school was established in 1903 inside military camps for Moros who wanted to serve the American Army. Lanao had literacy schools for Moro soldiers only in 1904. Other areas of Minsupala would follow out at a much later date. Act number 718 of 1903, this law declared null and void all land grants made by Moro, Datos, or Sultans and chiefs of non-Christian tribes when made without government authority or consent. Act number 926 of 1903, Public Land Act. This act declared as public government lands all lands not registered under Act number 496 of 1902. Under this law, public lands were to be disposed of in three ways: by homestead, purchase by individual or corporation, and lease. The Mining Law of 1905, this law declared all public lands in the Philippines as free, open for exploration, occupation, and purchase by citizens of the Philippines and the United States. The Cadastral Act of 1907, this law was designed to facilitate the acquisition of new land holdings. This law was deemed to have allowed the educated natives or Indios and non-Indios, bureaucrats, and American land speculators who were more familiar with the bureaucratic process to legalize claims as, through fraudulent service. Act 2874 of 1919. This law allowed Christian settlers to homestead 24 hectares while non-Christians were only allowed 10 hectares. Corporations were allowed 1,024 hectares and making Mindanao part of the U.S. territory. American colonial policy also suffers from inconsistency or executed differently in actual practice. While it made Mindanao part of the Philippine Islands under the Treaty of Paris, certain practices also showed that Americans wanted it for themselves. The administration of the Moro province unwittingly gave many American officials and capitalists a reason to make it a permanent territory of the United States. It began in 1906 and intensified through the 1920s when American planters, through the Zamboanga Chamber of Commerce, with the backing of American officials, petitioned Washington to incorporate Mindanao into the U.S. territory. In fact, Col Ralph Hoyt, then acting governor of the Moro province, echoed the same stand in his 1909 annual report. He recommended that Mindanao be segregated from the rest of the Philippines and declared as a territory of the US, not as a colony but a station and naval base with a civil military government, similar to the present government of the Moro province. Several missions or visits to the Philippines by high US officials, for example, is the by Secretary Dickinson in 1910, the Wood Forbes mission in 1921, and by Thompson in 1926, tended to support this view on the ground that Americans are in a better position than Filipinos to govern the Moros. Filipinos are unfit for self-government, and Moros are united for the continuation of American rule. Among other reasons, in fact, some Moro petitions during these periods highlighted the plan to incorporate Mindanao into the US rather than in the Philippine independence and independence and demonstrated that the Filipinos were not yet politically mature to handle their own affairs even after a period of Philippinization. Thus, the Filipino governing the Moros is an untenable proposition. Between 1921 and 1927, the political climate in the Philippines under Governor General Leonard Wood seems to have favored a continuing hold on the Philippine colony and the reversal of the Philippinization program under the democratic era. The move of Mindanao annexation reached its climax during this period. On June 21, 1926, New York Congressman Robert Bacon filed a bill in Congress for the removal of the Moro province from the jurisdiction of the present Philippine government and granting them a separate and distinct form of administration under the direct authority of the United States. 173 after it lapsed without action, another one was filed, the H.R. 12772 and H.R. 15479 and 69th U.S. Congress in 1926, known as the Bacon Bill. Its aim was to permanently annex Mindanao, excluding Misamis Province, the Sulu Archipelago, and Palawan into the U.S. territory, ostensibly to lessen U.S. independence on imported rubber. Conversely, it sought to detach this region from the Philippines as it posed an obstacle for its independence. Though it received support from many American officials, it unfortunately did not prosper. Mindanao would probably have taken the place of Hawaii as the 50th state of USA. Note that Hawaii and the Philippines were annexed by the US in the same year, which is 1898. In the end, all these moves were defeated by counter-protest among Filipino nationalists and by broader U.S. policy. For example, the Jones Act of 1916 determined to grant independence to the Philippines in the near future. Overall, the effect is that they reinforced the division between Moros and Christian Filipinos during that period. Fry 1978, Magdalena 1966, Frank Carpenter, governor of the Department of Mindanao and Sulu, observed that American officials encouraged such animosity. They also planted the seed of a peculiar separatist movement in Mindanao waged more strongly by Americans rather than by Moros. Pelzer concurred later. Such a separation has been suggested repeatedly by Americans interested in plantation development who played up the differences and antagonism between Christian and non-Christian Filipinos. Concluding piece, value, or statement. It must be clear to all of us now that if the Spaniards failed to conquer the Moros of Mindanao and Sulu, the Americans, in contrast, had succeeded this time in incorporating the Moro territories into the Philippine colony. American success was, of course, due to superior military power combined with diplomacy and divide and rule strategy. The Americans would strengthen their colonization efforts by tactfully extending friendship to friendly Moros and Lumans so that in time the latter would become loyal supporters and allies of the Americans. On the other hand, the new colonizers never hesitated in using force to deal with the recalcitrant and defiant elements. Especially among the Muslims, soon many of the Moros would realize that they were in a situation within which they were powerless to change, and so many would eventually succumb to the Americans. Subsequently, the once sovereign sultanates of Maguindanao and Sulu would be relegated to the status of de jure governments, inasmuch as actual power was then in the hands of the Americans and their native allies and supporters. The American policies, especially the public land laws, should enlighten us too that it was not the ordinary Christian natives who began the idea of taking the ancestral lands of the Moros and Lumads. In fact, the American colonizers even had a hard time convincing the first Christian volunteers to migrate to Mindanao. It thus appears American colonial policies were responsible for starting the systematic, massive, and institutional marginalization of the Moros and Lumads, which unfortunately continued and even intensified during the succeeding Philippine governments. The public laws, which are discriminatory and unfair to the Moros and Lumads, are very instructive in that they exemplify the structural violence at the time. By the term structural violence, we actually refer to those structures and institutions in society that harm people preventing them from meeting their needs. If laws of a particular government only favor the majority and discriminates its minority constituents, we certainly cannot expect the latter to appreciate and be loyal to that government. Hence, it is important for a government to be very sensitive and responsive to the needs of her constituents, be they part of the majority or minority, to ensure the loyalty of the people. It is ironic that while American policy expressed unification of the Philippine Islands and their peoples for nationhood, many American officials and businessmen also showed a desire to appropriate Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan to serve their own interests and cater to their own development. Under the guise of irreconcilable differences between Moros and Christian Filipinos and their obligation to protect the Moros and Lumads, they proposed but unsuccessfully to make the southern islands as permanent territory of the United States. Some Moro leaders supported the Americans in this self-serving motive, and this pattern was similar to the experience of some Pacific nations like Hawaii, which was also annexed in 1898. If we are to learn from this chapter of our history, we need to avoid making the same mistake of repeating it. We also need to prevent so-called class legislations or laws that give preferential treatment to a particular group while depriving and discriminating others. And that's all. Thank you.